Hello, everyone. Joshua Gilliland here, one of the co-founders of the Legal Geeks. With me is Mark Zaid, and we're going to talk about Secret Invasion Episode 2 Promises. Mark, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well, Josh, on the eve as we film of our nation's birthday.
Yes,
Hope
it's
you're well.
America Eve. So, how are you celebrating the 4th? Anything fun and exciting?
Hey, the usual. Well, depending on in the DC area, we're expecting, I think, storms, but we'll see how long that lasts. Now, the good old American barbecue
It
and
works.
working, the good old lawyer July 4th holiday. We're doing some work and barbecuing.
I will check email, so I will dial in. So, with that said, let's dig into some good old-fashioned legal issues because we're a nation of laws. So in this episode of Promises, we start with a flashback. It's after the Captain Marvel movie, and there's an exchange of promises between Fury and the Skrulls, where Fury promises to find the Skrulls, who are refugees, a homeworld, and they promise in return to play spy for Nick. I think for S.H.I.E.L.D., but it's not really clear or stated. And this raises an issue. Is that promise even enforceable? Did he have legal authority to do that? Well, for step one here, let's just talk about what a contract is. And there's offer, acceptance, some form of consideration, and performance, and you can have a contract. So what's the offer? Find me a homeworld. Is there acceptance? Yes. Consideration, the Skrulls are going to play spy for Nick Fury. They perform, and Nick either performs for a while or stops. And then, 20 years later, you have the snap, and Fury's dusted and then comes back and is not the same and runs off to build the weapons space station to protect Earth. Mark, what do you think about this?
Well, obviously, one of the first things we need to do is figure out what kind of authority Fury even had to make such a promise. Very unclear as far as what we've seen so far, because one thing we don't know, and frankly, every indication seems to be that Fury's almost talking for himself, or at least a very small group of people. And this is where it always gets to me in any of the Marvel series or movies. And I it's understandable why, but the notion that all of these things, these major things, are happening in such a vacuum, in the sense of even going through this whole episode where it looks, and this seems to be the storyline, that the Skrull were completely dependent on everything that Fury said, one individual, and that his disappearing in the blip, and it seems unclear as to whether, because Skrulls had to have been impacted, clearly, because every living creature was impacted by the blip, or 50% of them, and it could have been statistically that the Skrulls were not impacted as much as others by pure coincidence. But there seems to be no empathy or sympathy or understanding for the fact that he was gone for that 5-year period. But yet there doesn't seem to have been any handoff. It seems that Gravik, who is becoming the primary antagonist, I always get these protagonist / antagonist, whichever one he is, depending on your point of view, is so he's like Osama bin Laden. If people don't understand, we funded bin Laden and helped create essentially Al-Qaeda by creating those in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union in the 1980 and 79 invasion. And then once we left, they turned against us, and that led to the creation of Taliban, Al Qaeda, et cetera. And I'm generalizing, but essentially, same thing with Iran. CIA overthrows the Iranian government in 1953, puts the Shah in. That gets overthrown by Khomeini in 79, and that's what we're stuck with now. Like, we created that situation, and that's seemingly what we're seeing here. But yet, where's the organization? Where is anything? I mean, just because Fury disappeared doesn't mean that the US government disappeared. And clearly the UK government knows about the Skrulls very clearly. So, and presumably maybe others within NATO, and such. So I don't get the transition. I get it from a cinematography standpoint. I mean, it was just unworkable to explain, where's the Avengers? Where's the Fantastic Four? Where's Ghost Rider? Where's everybody? Where's Superman? Right? We're figuring out any of these overlaps. But it gets frustrating in understanding that the exact story plot just couldn't have happened this way. So no, there is no contract, because Nick Fury doesn't have the authority to bind the United States or the world, for sure, in promising the Skrulls. And in any event, I'm pretty confident that somebody else would have stepped in to have helped. And we talked about this in our first episode. It's like, I'm sorry, we travel to other worlds now. We hang out with as guardians who know about all these other worlds. You couldn't find some place for the Skrulls to go? That just doesn't make any sense.
I agree. I mean, the only way that this promise and potential contract would make any sense from an enforceability standpoint is if Fury was authorized before that meeting. If the president said, get their help and offer that you will find them a home world in return. That's their promise. Go in with that. That's the only way that can make any sense, because then he has authority from the United States government. And, we're not dealing with a treaty per se, so we don't have to deal with the Senate. So, but again, if that's the offer, and again, in this universe, Clinton still would have been president, that could have worked. Fun fact, since we do have another fictional president, this means Obama was just a one-term president in the MCU. But I've always found that funny. So, because it goes Obama Ellis, and then it's Ripcon. Here's a prediction. The president gets taken out in this, which is why when we see the next Captain America movie, Thunderbolt Ross is the president. So I bet Ross is the VP. So that's just my wild theory that the president gets taken out or is a Skrull or something bad happens, and you end up with Thunderbolt Ross from VP to president. Could be wrong.
Then, going on the other side, I think it's unclear whether the Skrulls have even upheld their end of the bargain, because it's unclear what that bargain was.
Yes.
And which also goes to, just from the reality standpoint, if the intimation is the Skrulls would help from a counterintelligence standpoint of obviously being shapeshifters able to infiltrate anywhere, as we see in this episode, which was used against humans by taking on the persona of some of the world's leaders, without clearly any humans knowing about that, from what we can tell so far. So that, which again goes to what I was saying before, their success would have been so significant, because we see it in this, unbeknownst to us. There's a million of the Skrulls, which we're still trying to figure out. All right, so where are they? I mean, they're not a million at the plant, the nuclear plant. It's somewhere in Russia. There can't be more than a few hundred, or I'm trying to remember. I think they said a number, maybe low thousands or something. But even then, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. that would be undetected by the Russians, much less others. But it again, and maybe we'll see this in future episodes. The involvement of governments in interacting with the Skrulls is something I'm interested in. Again, it's clearly not just the US, it's at least the US and the UK. We haven't seen any other governments beyond that, other than the NATO Secretary General, who's a Skrull. I'm not sure where, maybe you caught, I didn't catch where the Indian woman was from, but what position she was supposed to be playing.
I don't remember, because she's the one who doesn't go along with
the one, right?
with the
So
coup.
I'm not sure what, I presume everyone at that table was somebody significant in human world, but it wasn't clear to me, and I didn't research before we did this podcast to see who they were, but they clearly were very public personas, either in public life, government, or just television life, like the one American character who's the actor, I'm blanking on his name. He always shows up in like Star Trek Next Generation and stuff.
So the thing about the world leaders who are Skrulls or world personalities, the problem with that, because this is supposed to be like the legal ruling council for the Skrulls that Talos was a part of. That would mean that there shouldn't be anyone kidnapped, strapped to a table, that they're in order to mimic their mind and personality to know what they know, which would mean there's a head of state who rose up over 20 years in British politics in order to become PM. Because just by the way that council is supposed to be, from what we've seen, none of those people were kidnapped and replaced.
Or were they?
Yeah, but if they were kidnapped and replaced, then out of the gate, the ruling council or the governing council sounds illegitimate, because if you're governing based upon kidnapping people, that doesn't sound like a good place. Those aren't the allies that Talos should be interacting with. So did they create people out of whole cloth in the late 90s and then they rose up? I mean, to become Secretary General of NATO, there's a career path there. Like, that's not an easy thing just to go do. Same with British politics, understanding that contact sport. And, the British PM shows up in Parliament and gets yelled at. Like that, who signs up from that? What Skrull goes like, I'm in? You know what? I'm fine being a refugee. I'm in on this. So that the entire governing system that they have, I would think, doesn't have any humans who are kidnapped being used like what we saw with the Americans against Russia group, with those guys getting strapped to a table in a radioactive place that's bad for their health.
It doesn't, from the little we witnessed of them, the transition to allow Gravik to take control seems to be so fundamentally different and in opposition to their prior sentiments towards the world. I mean, it's almost trying to think of a comparable Star Trek episode, which when Vulcans go bad, right? I mean, it's Vulcans interacting among us with non-interference. And then all of a sudden, one of them, wants to take over the world and subverts the council. I mean, it's very unclear, because if you just think, I mean, again, we're only talking about a 30-year period, and the individuals who are part of the council in their positions are in their, some of them are in their they're in their 40s to 60s. So some, or at least a couple of them would have been adults when the Skrulls came. So that means either they did take over some human, or they created a personality. But so where's their history? I mean, I suppose if Fury and Shield or whatever was Shield would have existed at that time, maybe they created, personas and history for and social security numbers and everything. But then still, so how does it explain? That would make sense for the American Skrull people, but so how would we have created? I think the Secretary General was he French? I'm trying to think what nationality he was. He wasn't American or British, and I'm blanking off the top of my head.
So
He was some other European nationality.
Yeah, pick a country in Europe, but so he's European. That's a long career path for them to rise up and be good enough. Because it's one thing to impersonate someone. It's another thing to go, here's my personality as my cover story, and then I'm going to maintain for decades in order to live on this planet. And
by what purpose? What are you trying to do?
Yeah, I will become a right-wing talk show host. That doesn't, and even if they started out from a angelic perspective, at what point did they cross the line to go like, hey, we'll just start impersonating foreign leaders and television hosts, and we're still the good guys? Like it's just a really weird thing if once you start thinking about it, because the only good option is they created personas for themselves and careers. And one of them decided, you know what, I'm going to take a shot at British politics.
Well, and if you think about at least everything that I can recall from the movies on the Skrulls, so really just Captain Marvel and wherever else they added some content, whatever the Skrulls were doing was certainly behind the scenes with at least the US government, but it wasn't to draw attention to themselves. That was the last thing that they wanted done. So why then become polarizing talk show hosts and major government leaders who are interacting with one another? And I mean, so, and how do they tell that there's each other are Skrulls?
Yeah, there isn't a Skrull sensor that they have. It doesn't, you think I'll be a farmer in Nebraska and gonna lay low and stay off the radar. I'm going to be an accountant in the Bronx. Like they pick things where they will just blend in and not stand out, because NATO, you're standing out. British politician, you're standing out.
I mean, just think of all the instances where there's liability where they could expose themselves. I mean, do they have families? We don't know any of this stuff. Are the families Skrulls? We'll get to this notion of who Fury is with, but can a Skrull and a human mate? And what are those things? So, I mean, I have the television show V in my mind throughout this, especially since Fury calls them reptilian, which I guess they are, maybe not as much as the things in V, but hey, the human V baby became the way to defeat the V, whatever the V were called. I forget what their name was.
I don't remember either, but yes, I did a rewatch of that like a decade ago. And
what came to my mind, it's one of my favorite television shows, and there were a bunch of items from the show up for auction that I bid on recently, which I unfortunately lost out on. But it was such a great show back in the early 80s.
It was. So there's millions of Skrulls on Earth, or 1 million Skrulls on Earth. That means none of them did any form of refugee process that we have. And so they didn't go through Fury. Even if he was acting with authority from the United States government to be like the processing agent for those seeking asylum, they skipped him. So that means we literally have illegal aliens in the US, and there
All
could be,
over.
yeah. And that's just rude from a, host perspective. like it'd be one thing if they were just playing ball and going, hey, let's all be on the same team. Fury had a point about Talos' dream of humans and Skrulls living together. I would agree with Talos's sentiment, but humans have been killing each other. Would another species wanting to come and move in, like alienation style, would we accept them? Does it turn into, sure, come to our neck of the woods because you guys have great skills and you can help our country leapfrog any of the others? You have faster than light travel. Come on over. You're on our team now. So maybe it could have worked, but Talos didn't give Fury the opportunity to test that theory. And they just moved in, and now Fury and Talos aren't speaking to each other. So just problems.
Well, pretty much every other science fiction, I'm sure you can come up with novels, television, or movies. I find it hard to believe that having these aliens among us for 30 years, especially ones who can shapeshift and we can't apparently tell who the hell they are, that there wouldn't have been a faction within our government that was preparing every single day for how to defeat them, right? And creating something to kill them, to deactivate them, to impact them in some way. That we would have done autopsies of some of them to come up with medical devices to neutralize their powers, etc. I mean, that had to exist. I mean, just think about all the problems that we've had in storylines with human mutants, and we're freaked out by that. I find it hard to believe that there wouldn't have been a very significant faction, even one sympathetic and allied with the Skrulls, that wouldn't be anticipating a problem just like what we now are introduced in episode 2, that they're here among us and we didn't know about it. And that's what Fury knows. Fury, they don't even know about what we know, the audience, that they've infiltrated our most senior leadership in government and military, etc. So, I mean, there's just all sorts of problems here, which it will be very interesting to see if any of the other episodes addresses any of this backstory to try to explain, but I don't know.
The future will reveal itself when it's ready.
Yes.
Now let's get into the issue of the legal authority that the EU and England is trying to express over the United States, with having Rhodey go to England or Brussels to get yelled at. And the Europeans upset the president and go over to get scolded by Europeans. And like, first things first, there's my gut reaction is we declared your independence from you, so suck it. And 2, we saved you clowns twice. Quit whining. You guys, and when genocide started happening in Yugoslavia, we had to step up because none of you would leave the situation. So there'd be a way to push back in a very impolite fashion. But there's also just the factor of the president's not going to go get yelled at by Europeans for something that non-state actors have done.
Well, I'm unclear, and I only watched it the once, so I didn't pay careful enough attention to what the body was. Obviously, the European Union has no authority over the United States. There obviously are bodies, international bodies like the International Court of Justice that we are a member of when we want to be. When we don't, we just take our toys and go home, like when Nicaragua sued us back in the 80s for Iran-Contra and mining of their harbor, and we just walked out. The International Criminal Court, which is based in Brussels, no,
The Hague.
in The Hague, sorry, which we are not a member of, even though we helped create it. Actually, I worked on that issue back in the 90s. But none of these are not any entities where we would appear in that context. I mean, the closest to what we saw in that episode would be obviously the United Nations, and you've got the General Assembly, and you've got the Security Council, of which we're a permanent member of the 5. But the notion that I'm still unclear what actual position Rhodey is. I think we talked about that maybe he's vice president, but that doesn't seem to make sense.
Nope, not now. They call him Colonel, and he said he was the a special
envoy, special assistant to the president. That we would just send a colonel. No offense to colonels. I've represented lots of colonels. Have a high degree of respect for how few actually achieve that rank, but to think that we would send a colonel over to respond to the heads of state, even though I'm not quite sure. Clearly it was a setup because they were Skrulls mostly, and the United States didn't have anything to do with the bombing in Moscow. Even if it was Americans who were involved, the little we know of this Americans Against Russia group are they might be former military and soldiers of fortune, but they're like militia guys. They're Prigozhin folks. They're not affiliated with the U.S. government. And it was even unclear in the first episode, frankly, what role Fury has with the U.S. government. Clearly, by now, the second episode, he's on the outs. He is rogue, even though that was intimated by Rhodes that Fury was rogue in the first episode. So, all right, it's not realistic, but we're dealing with Marvel superheroes, so none of it's realistic, right?
Yeah, but it was at least, it didn't look crazy, as opposed to Falcon and Winter Soldier, with just the things that happened. Like the senator leading a hearing that should be something from the executive branch. Like, it's none of that stuff that's happening here. This is,
and it's always, I guess, we're too much in. Look, I'm still enjoying watching the series, and doing these types of podcasts, I guess maybe sometimes ruins it, because we get such in the weeds as the comic book nerds that we are, or the science fiction nerds, or whatever it might be, that when you start dissecting it, it doesn't make sense. It wasn't intended to make sense. And I think the thing really that frustrates me the most is some of what we are railing against would have been an easy fix. Like,
yes,
why have the EU? I get it when you accelerate things, or you watch Law and Order, and for the most part, Law and Order is very accurate until it goes off of some pipe dreams when it wants to push an ideological agenda on a particular subtext. But other than the speed of the proceedings, which are completely unrealistic, which is totally understandable when you've got an hour to do your broadcast, or 48 minutes plus commercials, but the law, because it's written mostly by lawyers at times, is pretty spot on. I've even used it at times in cases, because it at least gave me something to research, because I saw it in a Law and Order episode. It's lawyers writing legal programs. This stuff, some of this that we're complaining about could have easily been addressed, and it wasn't, because I get, they're just not attempting to. So
Yeah, which goes hire us, would fix it. We're available.
that's
So
right. We can do it.
we can do, we have
Disney,
means.
Disney, where are you? Call us. Legal Geeks
We'll be
available.
there.
Contract.
Just put us on retainer.
I would even just take free annual passes.
Yeah, that just have us over. T-shirts,
Yeah.
like it would be fun. That said, let's talk about the firing of Nick Fury, which is one thing that I focused on, and this goes back to the original Sin storyline from the comics, which was excellent, was that, did Nick Fury violate the Logan Act? And somebody might ask, well, what's the Logan Act? And that's 18 USC section 953. And it deals with private correspondence with foreign governments. Any citizen of the United States, wherever he may be, who, without authority of the United States, direct or indirectly, commences or carries on any correspondence or intercourse with any foreign government or any officer or agent thereof, with intent to influence the measures or conduct of any foreign government or of any officer or agent thereof, in relation to any disputes or controversies with the United States, or to defeat the measures of the United States, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 3 years or both. Whew. So, it's basically US citizens aren't supposed to have their own foreign policy.
Yeah, and this dates back to the earliest days of our country, 18th century. It is rarely, if ever, used. For those who are politically savvy, they probably know the Logan Act because it came up with General Michael Flynn, who was the director of DIA. I dealt with the guy when he was at DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. Then he was Trump's national security advisor for like 11 days, 13 days, something like that, in 2017, until he got fired. And he met with the Russian ambassador to the US, Ambassador Kislyak, supposedly lied about that to President Trump. At least that was the basis that he used to fire. And Flynn was prosecuted. He wasn't prosecuted for Logan Act, as I recall. I think it was for violation of FARA, Foreign Agents Registration. I have to go back and look. Somebody can correct me. I'm just blanking on it. But there are so many times, like I have dealt with a lot of foreign policy issues, and I always have a great deal of respect for former Ambassador Bill Richardson, former US to UN ambassador, New Mexico governor. And when I was dealing with a client who was imprisoned in Iran, he was helping. And he's helped on lots of issues like that to try and get some of our people out of private citizens out of horrible situations where the government can't really function, or at least doesn't have the ability to do it. And they're never prosecuted. Now, Logan Act, of course, probably wouldn't apply here because it deals with foreign governments, and these are Skrulls. So it doesn't talk about alien governments. That would be a good potential defense.
But Fury's interacting with, the British spy master.
Oh, well, in that part, yeah. Sorry, my cat is climbing into my closet among lots of collectibles, and I hate when he does. Get out of the closet, cat! And this cat looks like the cat who scratched Fury's eye, a flurkin. He looks just like a frickin' flurkin.
So be careful. I mean, I had to let the dog out.
Flurkin, get out of the closet. Damn it. Yeah. So, well, again, what we don't know, and you talked about Fury getting fired. All right. I represent federal employees all the time and defend them against getting fired. What I don't know is, what the heck is Fury? What was he in the first episode? What was he in the second episode? Certainly, if he was acting on behalf of the US government, even though he was semi-rogue in the first episode, ostensibly he was still US government, not necessarily a big deal. He's meeting with the director of MI6, or right? Or the station chief, I suppose, of Moscow from MI6. I don't know what her position was at that particular time. It's a little unclear. But when he gets fired, is he a political appointee? Is which he acts at the power, the leisure of the president of the United States, or is he a civil servant, senior executive service, where he would have due process rights for being fired? He's got to be given a notice of termination in writing. He's got to be given an opportunity to respond in writing, to have counsel, which he can pay for himself. I mean, all sorts of things. Very unclear because we don't have a good sense of what Fury actually is playing by way of his role.
What I thought of was J. Edgar Hoover finally getting the boot from Richard Nixon. And Hoover served for decades.
Yep, 1920. I had this. I just was at his grave recently. See, he died in 72. The FBI was created in 1924 to 1972. FBI was created in 1908, and I think he served from 24 to 72.
Yeah, so long tenured guy. It was hard to get rid of him because he knew where bodies were buried, and he was a problem. So again, Nixon got rid of Hoover, and
God get rid of Hoover, because Hoover died.
Yeah, Nixon was trying to get Hoover out of his position. So that was, I just remember that from one of the Nixon books. I don't remember all the details because it's been like 25 years since I read it. But that's kind of Fury. Like, he's just hanging out. He's been there for decades, and he's outlasted presidents, and dealt with firing a nuclear weapon without presidential authorization. So again, little things like that, just kind of scary. So, but the idea of due process rights is interesting, and I think would make sense. But the issue is SHIELD just got so big and weird and out of control by the time of Winter Soldier that what was he? So there's, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe we'll learn more. Let's take a moment to talk about torture, because this plays into the, the 24 card of, if I just hurt someone long enough, I will get the truthful answer. So we have the Sonia Falsworth, who's the British spy master or MI6 station chief, whatever they're calling her. She cuts off a prisoner's finger. And like, this person is supposed to be like the US national, or it's that the Russians grabbed at the terrorist attack. And she cuts off his finger, and the finger turns back to Skrull. And we do see that the finger's cut off, and then she injects him with a poison to superheat his body.
Which goes to what I was saying before, right? Because clearly that was something designed for the Skrulls.
Yeah, it's like, what was like 140 centigrade? So like that's hot. That's insanely hot. And you can see his neck boiling and the veins showing. He's having a bad time. So let's just talk about the Convention Against Torture, and we can handle this like a tennis match going back and forth because we both have notes on it. So torture is defined under Article 1 as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or person acting in an official capacity. Long way of saying Sonia the spy master cut off a dude's finger and then poisoned him to get information. There's,
I mean, I find it ironic that it's the Brit, if she is in fact human, I suppose, right? But she's crueler than the Russians who had this guy. Like, the Russians didn't think about torturing him before the Brit came in to torture him because they were unsuccessful, and that the one guy who, you know, he was directly out of has that, what's that phrase, typecast right out of the studio as to what you would expect would be someone who would torture. And he's like, oh, I don't think you're going to be able to do anything that we wouldn't have done, that we didn't already try. Really? She like got him to admit things because she cut his freaking finger off and injected him with this stuff. Now, again, it's unclear. I think the insinuation is whoever these Russians are who are responding, not even responding, subservient to this Brit, they don't seem to know he's a Skrull.
I agree with that. And they're beating on the guy. So it's not like it's happy fun time. You know, he's in a butcher shop getting wailed on by Russian thugs to KGB, whatever secret police that they have, to beat the snot out of someone until they confess. They have an escape hatch in the torture chamber because that's how prepared they are.
Yeah.
So clearly they do this on more than one occasion. So it's like, is this Skrull on Skrull torture? Like, is she one? I don't know. Or is she just super ruthless in kind of like the evil Mary Poppins type of way? Like, is this, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a ton we don't know. This scene is perplexing for so many different reasons.
And it's important to note that like torture is illegal. So the, going back to the Convention on Torture under Article 2, subsection 2, no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency may be invoked as a justification of torture. Like, there's just nothing legal about what she does. And yes, the Brits adopted this. The United Kingdom follows the Convention on Torture.
Yeah, there are a few international conventions and norms that are called Jus Cogens norms. That's Latin for essentially none can derogate from it. Genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, extrajudicial killing. And the Torture Convention was enacted back in the 80s. The Brits ratified it pretty quickly. The US ratified it in the mid 90s. And it is, as you said, completely illegal to deal with this. We're dealing with this issue right now down in Guantanamo with the USS Cole bombing. So I've worked on a whole bunch of Gitmo cases in representing people down there, the lawyers, the American lawyers, not the detainees. And right now, the military judge for the military commission is dealing with the issue of the CIA tortured. You can call it enhanced interrogation measures or torture. Most of us will call it torture, waterboarding, etc., which we actually prosecuted the Japanese for war as a war crime post World War II for waterboarding our soldiers. And they're trying to decide right now whether any evidence can be used in these cases against these high-value detainees because they were tortured. So it's a little bit ironic because even though this is taking place in 2025 in this program, and unclear, of course, what's happening in their world, did it happen in our world, vice versa? So like, we don't know if Russia invaded Ukraine in their world, but certainly when they filmed this, they knew, well, I'm trying to think, when would they have filmed it? I think they knew that Russia had invaded Ukraine. So and of which there's lots of allegations that the Russians have committed torture and war crimes against the Ukrainian population. And yet the Russian in this scene, even though they're beating on the guy, doesn't go as far as this so-called identified British agent who clearly tortures and then escapes. So more to be known clearly in the episodes to come, especially on this relationship between the Brits and the Russians and how the Skrulls fit into that. But that scene was definitely a big legal no-no.
Yeah, we're supposed to be the good guys. And when any pop culture starts normalizing torture as like, hey, this is what we do to get information because it's dramatic. So we'll cut off somebody's finger and again engage in war crimes, crimes against humanity, breaking international law. It sends a bad message because
it's always just the ticking time bomb theory. You know, if you know there's a nuclear weapon going to go off, here it is. You know these Skrulls, these splinter Skrulls, which are now apparently becoming the mainstream Skrulls, are using illegal weapon, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons potentially against the Earth population. And this one Skrull supposedly knows where Varric is. At least that's what the Brit was trying to get from him.
Yeah, it's not good. I mean, I fondly remember Senator John McCain speaking out against torture when we were debating this. And, and even he articulated, maybe there's the need that you can have an affirmative defense if you have to break somebody's arm, but we should not start from the position that torture is okay, that, enhanced interrogation is a pretty way of saying torture. And like, we're supposed to be the good guys. And studies have shown that people will say anything to make the torture stop. They will say what the torturer wants to hear. So it's just problematic.
Yeah, and it's what we've been talking about, of course, is the international laws. Every country then would need to implement it into their own national jurisdiction. So one of the provisions we did at 18 USC 2340A makes it illegal for torture, that we could prosecute the offender, whether if they're a national of the US, which is nationality jurisdiction, or interestingly enough, if the person is present in the United States, regardless of the nationality of the victim or alleged offender, which that is a huge step, because I actually testified back in 1995, I think it was. God, it was a long time ago. I'm trying to remember back. I think it was 1995, before a House Judiciary Subcommittee on creating what became the War Crimes Act of 1996. And we were debating nationality, we're debating jurisdiction, nationality jurisdiction, universal jurisdiction. We had an Office of Special Investigations in the Justice Department that we would call fondly the Nazi Hunter Unit, but they never prosecuted Nazis because we didn't have the laws to do so. We had lots of Nazis found here in the United States. We would deport them because they would have lied, much like the Skrulls would have, on their citizenship paperwork, because they weren't who they said they were. And actually, there was a question back in the day, I don't think it's still on there, were you ever a member of the National Socialist Party? And obviously, these people would pretend to be immigrants, asylum seekers from Europe, refugees, and they would lie and say they weren't National Socialists, Nazis. So we could deport them. But there is a large group of us, and this statute on torture in the US implemented that, to say that, look, if we find someone in our country who committed torture, I would argue it should be committed war crimes, committed genocide. We haven't gone that far, actually, which amazes me. I think it's pretty embarrassing that we haven't, but we will. I'm actually suing a Libyan warlord civilly under the Torture Victim Protection Act, which gives us jurisdiction over individuals found in the United States who committed torture abroad. And that could be even against non-US nationals. So actually all my clients are Libyans for suing this Libyan warlord who actually happens to be a US citizen because of, similar to Skrulls, secret relationships with our intelligence community that he came to the United States and we gave him citizenship, etc. So, really interesting things about whether we can do it. So if she, what's her name, Sonia Fowlsworth, comes to the United States, we can prosecute her under this statute.
So troubling. And also good to understand just some of the history to this, because again, late 90s through early 2000s. Now, towards the end, we see Nick go to what looks like a house. There's a female Skrull there because she's in Skrull form. And he goes in and puts on a wedding ring, and it's like they're married. That was surprising. So just from like, I'm a bachelor, but the idea that, hey, honey, I've been on the space station for several years and now I just came home. You cool? What's for dinner? Like that just seems like a very odd relationship, unless she also was on the spaceship and came down and went to the safe house, which looked like a pretty cool house. That looked pretty groovy. Could Nick, a human, marry a female Skrull who's a shapeshifter? Well, first things first, the law is not designed for this, because while we have interracial marriage, that goes back to loving, we don't have interspecies marriage. That's just weird. So
yeah, it would be like, and because Gravik said he liked dogs so much, and the NATO Secretary General said he preferred to be human than dog, and Gravik said, no, I'd rather be a dog. Dogs don't lie, or something like that. It is, as a legal matter, because Skrulls clearly are humanoid, and if they lived among us, one would imagine that the laws would envelop them as if it would be a loving, case law loving situation, Caucasian, African American. At the moment, because we don't know they exist, it would be like trying to marry your dog.
yeah, it just
Can't do it.
Yeah, can't do it. It's the law is not designed for this. We're not designed for an alien race to come
I
into.
think in some countries actually you can, but
Yeah, wasn't there?
I want to say I read about that or saw that on the news once, but in the United States you cannot.
Yeah, I thought there was an Israeli woman who married a dolphin. Like there was something weird. We don't do that here. We do have a broad view of love is love, but you're not marrying outside of the human species.
Yeah, in most states it's illegal to even have sexual intercourse with another species. Although it depends on the state. I've actually had to deal with this in my law practice at times. And the Secret Service used to ask a question on their polygraph, whether you've ever committed a serious crime. And they'd then give you a list, and on the list would be sex with animals. And I had to argue with them once because it's not illegal in every state. It just isn't. You can't marry them, but it's not illegal to have sex with them. In most states, it's just a misdemeanor. But yeah, no intermarriage yet with Skrulls.
Yeah, and yeah, it's just the comics haven't gone there. The Furies had, a long relationship with the Val and Contessa, but and in the comic, that's how we found out Skrulls were making a play on Earth. But yeah, that's just weird.
Well, I can't imagine. I'm sure I missed this because this was probably a period of time when I was out of comics. Someone at some point must have made an issue between the Vision and Scarlet Witch and whether they could. I mean, they actually did marry, did they not? As I recall,
Yeah,
I
and
think that was in my time, but he's not humanoid. So did someone contest that? Do you remember?
I don't remember anyone contesting it. I remember Immortus performed the wedding ceremony. I thought that was a limited series done by John Byrne. Maybe I'm wrong on John.
There was in the 80s, there was like a 6-part limited series on Scarlet Witch and the Vision. I don't remember if that's where they got married or not, but it was like 1984, 1985.
Yeah, I believe you're right, and leads to West Coast Avengers, and that was
Yeah.
at the time when canon was the Vision was an updated version of the original Human Torch, and then later that's retcon that Human Torch was a synthoid, Vision's an android, completely different. Thus, they're two different entities, and they end up finding the original Human Torch. Anywho, it's a lot of nerdery from the 80s and happy memories from those comics.
Yes.
Going to John's Comic Connection and good times in Sunnyvale. That said, we're getting a tease from, I think, another comic era, and that's the Super Skrull. And the Fantastic Four comics, it was a Skrull that had all the powers of the Fantastic Four.
Yep. FF15, as I recall.
Good memory. We see this experiment with this machine taking place where they have a sample from Groot, a frost giant, Cole, who was one of Thanos's henchmen that had his arm cut off in Central Park, and Extremis from Iron Man 3. That sounds like, and then the confession that they're trying to make us stronger. That sounds like Super Skrulls. It's also a clay duck sitting there for them to have Super Skrulls be an issue, for Skrulls to become enhanced and thus be able to, again, having Groot-like powers. A little weird, odd choice, still strong. The frost giant and the large frost giant and the Thanos minion, clearly strong, clearly powerful, clearly a threat. And just because they can shapeshift doesn't mean they have the powers of who they shapeshift into. So wanting to have an enhancement to already springboard from their enhanced strength is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly going to be different than what we knew from the comic books. I'm not sure if there's any relationship between what this will be ultimately. I am still trying to get a sense of Skrulls, of what their ability is, because again, it seemed, it clearly, besides shape-shifting, obviously, and whatever this mind power now is, and then they are stronger than us, but still easily felled by regular bullets. So, but yet can also take whatever this was that the MI6 character injected into their bloodstream, into the one fake American Skrull's bloodstream, that heated him up to whatever degree, 100+ Fahrenheit, centigrade, whatever it was, clearly burning him from the inside. But then I think, if I remember, Gravik just killed him with a single gunshot.
Yeah, took him behind the barn and shot him. So it's just, I get bullets kill, but it's a very strange relationship that they're enhanced, but not that enhanced. That they're stronger, they can take a beating because we've seen them fight, The Skrull in the chair did take a significant beating, but that was humans. So is that like a 5-year-old trying to, punch a, like a 30-year-old? Like it's just an annoyance. But cutting off a finger, that would get your attention. Yeah, well, I get a bullet causing harm. It's like Jessica Jones, enhanced strength, but not bulletproof. So, not resistant to alcohol. So, like we have those factors. Now, you did raise the issue of like, do the Avengers know about this or anybody else?
Well, that was what I was just talking about in the beginning. This storyline is so important and implicates such significant national security issues globally, and yet like it's Fury and Rhodey. That's it. Right. And Agent Hill, who gets killed in Moscow and whose mother comes to England to retrieve the body, which I wasn't quite sure what was going on with that either, but maybe there was some backstory there I'm not familiar with.
No, not on film. This is the first mention of her mom. I think back to the scene where Rhodey and Fury are having drinks, and Rhodey makes the comment about getting our friends involved. And I think he's talking about Avengers. I think he's talking about other superheroes, even though we're at the stage that we're kind of, the Avengers are dissembled. Like there isn't a core team. There's no Cap isn't there leading them or Tony funding them. Like it would take like Clint stepping up to get the team back together again, which.
Well, he's still healing from his snowmobile accident. So.
True. Working
and great that he recovered. Very happy for him.
That was totally terrifying. Like, and having my aunt and uncle have a cabin and close to there, so glad he's okay. But again, like those are you look at the original Avengers lineup, like Thor's not on Earth, Jane's dead. So Scott, so it's like we're looking at Scott and Clint to get the band together, which they could do, but they would need reason to do it.
I say bring in Deadpool.
Yeah.
Right? You can't kill a guy pretty much. Deadpool can take care of it. Ryan Reynolds can take care of everything.
He does make everyone feel better. Yeah. So, but again, there's a lot to unpack with these episodes, and we've covered a lot of ground. So
we'll see what happens next week.
Yeah. So after fireworks, stay up late, watch the next episode.
Actually, it's not next week. What am I saying? It's in 2 days from when we're filming this. So
we will be
this week. We'll see what happens in the next week's episode this week.
And then we'll talk about it next week, because that's just how
we'll talk about it next week.
So because it gives us time to think about it. So everyone, we still can't say much about Comic-Con other than we'll be there. And so you can see us then, and we'll have a good time. Can't wait. Absolutely excited. And until then, everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay geeky. Take care now.